It is the morning of June 4, 1942. The time is 10:22 a.m. High above the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Central Pacific, the sky is a brilliant, cloud-dappled blue. Down below, churning the cobalt water into white wakes, sails the most powerful, lethal, and victorious naval armada the world has ever seen, the Kido Butai, the elite carrier strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For 6 months, this fleet has been utterly invincible. It has shattered the American battle line at Pearl Harbor, swept across the South Pacific, and driven the British from the Indian Ocean. Right now, its 4 magnificent aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, are preparing to launch a massive, crushing blow that will annihilate the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet. The Japanese flight decks are packed tight with heavily armed aircraft. Fuel lines snake across the wooden planks. Mechanics rush frantically among stacked high-explosive bombs and deadly aerial torpedoes. The Japanese commanders stand on their bridges, confident that total victory is only moments away. But they do not look up. They do not see the tiny, glinting specks plummeting out of the sun at 300 miles an hour. They do not hear the terrifying, banshee wail of the American Dauntless dive bombers until it is far, far too late. In exactly 5 minutes, the invincible Japanese fleet will be transformed into an apocalyptic inferno of twisted steel and burning flesh. In 5 minutes, the myth of Japanese invincibility will be shattered forever. In 5 minutes, the entire trajectory of the Second World War will change. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, a breathtaking saga of brilliant intelligence, agonizing blunders, impossible courage, and the most consequential 5 minutes in the history of naval warfare. To understand the sheer magnitude of what happened on that fateful June morning, we must wind the clock back 6 months, to the smoking, oil-choked waters of Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire unleashed a brilliant, devastating surprise attack that crippled the American battleship fleet. In the weeks and months that followed, the Japanese military machine seemed to be an unstoppable juggernaut. They swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with lightning speed and terrifying efficiency. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. Hong Kong, Malaya, and the seemingly impregnable British fortress of Singapore were overrun. The Philippines were conquered, leading to the horrors of the Bataan Death March. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious lifeblood reserves of oil, were seized. The Japanese forces were riding a tidal wave of victory, fueled by highly trained, combat veteran pilots flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter plane that completely outclassed anything the Allies could put in the air. The grand architect behind this stunning string of victories was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was a brilliant, complex man. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and understood the terrifying industrial potential of the United States better than almost any other man in the Japanese High Command. He knew that Japan could not win a protracted war of attrition against the American industrial behemoth. His strategy from the very beginning was to inflict such catastrophic, demoralizing defeats on the United States Navy that the American public would lose the stomach for war, forcing their government to the negotiating table to sue for peace. Pearl Harbor had been the first step. But Pearl Harbor had failed in one crucial, fatal respect. The American aircraft carriers had not been in port. They had survived. For Yamamoto, the survival of the American carriers was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Japanese Empire. His fears were violently realized on April 18, 1942, when 16 American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle did the impossible. They launched from the heaving deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, flew hundreds of miles across the ocean, and dropped their bombs on Tokyo. The physical damage of the Doolittle raid was entirely negligible, a few destroyed buildings and minor fires, but the psychological impact was seismic. For the first time in history, the sacred homeland of Japan had been struck. The emperor's life had been put at risk. The Japanese military establishment was deeply humiliated. For Admiral Yamamoto, this was the final straw. The Doolittle raid proved that as long as the American aircraft carriers existed, Japan could never be secure. He resolved to draw the remnants of the US Pacific Fleet out into the open ocean and annihilate them in a decisive, winner-take-all battle. Yamamoto's eyes fell upon a tiny, seemingly insignificant speck of coral and sand in the vastness of the Central Pacific. Midway Atoll. Located roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, Midway was little more than a resting place for albatrosses and a small American naval air station. But strategically, it was the vital sentry guarding the approach to the Hawaiian Islands. Yamamoto knew that if he threatened Midway, the American Pacific Fleet commander, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, would have absolutely no choice but to send his precious aircraft carriers to defend it. To achieve this, Yamamoto devised a plan of staggering, almost bewildering complexity, known as Operation MI. It involved nearly 200 ships, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and his crown jewels, the 4 heavy fleet carriers of the Kido Butai, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The plan relied on intricate deception, strict radio silence, and a highly coordinated timetable. Yamamoto would send a diversionary force far to the north to attack the Aleutian Islands near Alaska, hoping to draw American attention and forces away. Then, Nagumo's carriers would launch a devastating air raid to pulverize the defenses on Midway. An amphibious invasion force would then land and capture the atoll. When the American fleet finally rushed out from Pearl Harbor to save Midway, they would be sailing blindly into a massive trap. Yamamoto's main body of heavily armed battleships, waiting hundreds of miles behind the carriers, would close in and send the American ships to the bottom of the Pacific. It was a grand, sweeping, Napoleonic vision of naval warfare. But it possessed one fatal, hubristic flaw. It assumed the Americans would act exactly as the Japanese expected them to. Yamamoto did not know that deep in the humid, windowless basement of the naval shipyard at Pearl Harbor, a quiet, eccentric genius was systematically dismantling the Japanese battle plan. This basement was known as the Dungeon, the home of Station Hypo, the United States Navy's combat intelligence and code-breaking unit. It was commanded by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant cryptanalyst who often worked in a smoking jacket and carpet slippers, surviving on minimal sleep and sheer nervous energy. Rochefort and his exhausted team of linguists, mathematicians, and puzzle solvers had achieved the impossible. They had cracked a significant portion of the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, known as JN-25B. Breaking the code was not like reading a newspaper. It was an agonizing process of piecing together fragments of intercepted radio traffic, analyzing traffic patterns, and making highly educated guesses. By the spring of 1942, Station Hypo was intercepting a massive surge in Japanese radio communications. They could read enough to know that a massive operation was in the works, and that the target was designated by the geographic code letters AF. Rochefort was convinced that AF stood for Midway. His superiors in Washington, however, were skeptical. They believed the Japanese were targeting the South Pacific, perhaps Port Moresby, or even the west coast of the United States. They demanded proof. To provide this proof, Rochefort devised one of the most brilliant and consequential ruses in the history of military intelligence. He instructed the commander of the American base at Midway to transmit a fake message in the clear, unencrypted, stating that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and they were desperately short of fresh water. The trap was set. Now the men in the dungeon waited. 2 days later, A Japanese listening post on Wake Island intercepted the fake message and dutifully transmitted an encrypted report back to Tokyo. Station Hypo intercepted the Japanese transmission, decrypted it, and read the magical words, "AF is short of water." The debate was instantly over. The target was Midway. Furthermore, through relentless, exhausting decryption work, Rocheford's team was able to provide Admiral Nimitz with the complete Japanese order of battle, their approximate route of advance, and the exact date they planned to strike. June 4. Admiral Chester Nimitz now possessed the greatest weapon a commander could ever ask for. He knew the enemy's mind. But knowing the plan and stopping it were two entirely different things. The disparity in forces was terrifying. Nimitz was facing the combined might of the Japanese Navy, with a severely depleted, battered fleet. He had no battleships. They were still resting in the mud of Pearl Harbor, or deployed elsewhere. His only offensive weapons were his aircraft carriers. He had the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet, forming Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was a cruiser commander, a quiet, deeply analytical tactician who had taken over the task force after the aggressive, fiery Admiral William Bull Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Nimitz's third carrier, the USS Yorktown, was limping back to Pearl Harbor from the Battle of the Coral Sea, trailing a massive oil slick, its flight deck mangled and its innards heavily damaged by a Japanese bomb. The initial estimates stated the Yorktown would require 3 months in a dry dock to be rendered battle-worthy again. Nimitz did not have 3 months. He had 3 days. When the Yorktown entered dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz personally inspected the damage. Wearing wading boots, he sloshed through the flooded compartments and issued a simple, impossible order. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." What followed was a miracle of American industrial willpower. Over 1,400 civilian shipyard workers swarmed the vessel. They worked around the clock, ignoring all safety protocols. The dry dock plunged into an inferno of sparks, hammering, and shouting. The power grid of Honolulu experienced rolling blackouts to feed the massive welding machines. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, sleeping in the corners of the hangar deck, refusing to leave the ship. In exactly 72 hours, the Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor, her flight deck patched with wood, civilian welders still aboard repairing her internal bulkheads as she sailed toward destiny. She formed Task Force 17 under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would assume overall tactical command of the combined American fleet. Nimitz's orders to Fletcher and Spruance were a masterpiece of calculated risk. They were to sail to a predetermined location approximately 300 miles northeast of Midway, an area of the ocean designated as Point Luck. There, they would wait in ambush. Nimitz strictly ordered his commanders to adhere to the principle of calculated risk. They were to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, but were absolutely forbidden to expose their own precious carriers to destruction, unless the prospect of inflicting greater damage upon the enemy was certain. The survival of the Pacific Fleet hung in the balance. If these 3 carriers were lost, the west coast of the United States would be entirely defenseless. As the calendar turned to June 3, the vast Pacific theatre was quiet, heavy with the suffocating tension of the impending clash. Far to the north, the Japanese diversionary force struck the Aleutians, bombing Dutch Harbour. Nimitz ignored it. He knew the main blow was coming at Midway. Long-range American PBY Catalina flying boats, slow, lumbering, twin-engine patrol aircraft, scoured the ocean west of Midway, searching desperately for the approaching Japanese armada. Finally, on the morning of June 3, a Catalina pilot spotted a large group of ships through breaks in the clouds. It was the Japanese invasion force, the troop transports and escorting cruisers. Land-based American bombers from Midway launched a long-range attack, dropping their bombs from high altitude. They hit absolutely nothing. The Japanese invasion force sailed on, unbothered. But the vital piece of the puzzle, the 4 heavy carriers of the Kido Butai under Admiral Nagumo, remained hidden, cloaked by a heavy weather front moving silently toward the atoll. The true battle began in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4. At 4:30 a.m., the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu roared to life. The glowing blue exhaust flames of 108 aircraft engines illuminated the pitch-black ocean. Under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, a massive strike wave of Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate level bombers roared off the wooden decks and formed up in the morning sky, turning their noses toward Midway Atoll. Simultaneously, Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, ordered a small number of scout planes to be launched to search the ocean to the east and south, just in case any American ships were lurking in the area. Nagumo was not particularly worried. His intelligence assured him that the American fleet was still anchored in Pearl Harbor. The search was merely a doctrinal precaution. However, a fateful delay occurred. The scout plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, designated Tone number 4, experienced catapult trouble. It launched a critical half-hour late. It seemed like a minor mechanical hiccup, an insignificant detail in a massive operation. But in the unforgiving arithmetic of war, that 30-minute delay would soon alter the destiny of nations. On Midway Island, the American radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike force while they were still nearly 100 miles out. The island's defenders scrambled everything they had. The air defense of Midway was a tragically mismatched collection of obsolete aircraft flown by brave, inexperienced young men. Marine Corps pilots took off in Brewster Buffaloes, sluggish, undergunned fighters that the pilots bitterly referred to as flying coffins. They climbed into the morning sky to intercept the seasoned veterans of the Kido Butai. The ensuing air battle was a slaughter. The agile, deadly Japanese Zeros danced around the heavy American fighters, tearing them to pieces with their 20mm cannons. The Marines fought with desperate, suicidal courage, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Within minutes, the American fighter defense was virtually annihilated. With the sky cleared, the Japanese bombers unleashed hell upon Midway. They pounded the power plant, the seaplane hangars, the fuel dumps, and the command posts. Massive plumes of thick black smoke billowed into the sky, visible for miles. The island was devastated. But as Lieutenant Tominaga circled above the burning atoll, he realized a critical failure. The American anti-aircraft fire had been fierce and accurate. More importantly, the runways, the vital airstrips needed to launch the invasion, were still largely intact. The defenders were battered, but the island was not neutralized. At 7 a.m., Tominaga keyed his radio and sent a fateful message back to Admiral Nagumo on the Akagi. There is need for a second strike. This message placed Admiral Chuichi Nagumo in the center of a terrible, agonizing dilemma. Nagumo was an old-school torpedo officer, a man who believed in rigid adherence to naval doctrine. He had been a controversial choice to command the carrier strike force, lacking the visionary aviation background of Yamamoto. Aboard the Japanese carriers, half of the aircraft had been kept in reserve, waiting below decks in the hangars. According to strict doctrine, these reserve planes were armed with armor-piercing bombs and aerial torpedoes, specifically prepared to attack enemy warships should the American fleet suddenly appear. But Nagumo's scout planes had reported nothing but empty ocean. He believed the Americans were nowhere near Midway. Now, his strike commander was telling him that Midway needed to be bombed again to ensure the success of the invasion. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made a decision that made perfect logical sense based on the information he had. He ordered the reserve aircraft to be stripped of their anti-ship weapons and rearmed with high-explosive land bombs for a second strike on Midway. Instantly, the hangar decks of the 4 Japanese carriers erupted into a frenzy of exhausting, back-breaking labour. Sweating mechanics rushed to lower the massive heavy torpedoes from the bellies of the Kate bombers, wrestling them onto carts and rolling them away. They hauled heavy land bombs from the magazines and began hoisting them into the bomb racks. It was a massive logistical undertaking, requiring time and immense physical effort. Then, at 7:28 a.m., the entire strategic picture violently shattered. The delayed scout plane, Tone Number 4, finally broke radio silence. The pilot reported sighting 10 enemy surface ships, roughly 200 miles northeast of Midway.
On the bridge of the Akagi, the atmosphere turned to ice. Enemy ships.
Nagumo was stunned. How could they be here? What kind of ships were they? Cruisers? Destroyers? The scout plane had not specified. If there were American aircraft carriers out there, Nagumo was in mortal danger. His reserve planes, the only weapons he had to strike an enemy fleet, were currently sitting in the hangars, half-armed with the wrong kind of bombs. He frantically radioed the scout plane, demanding to know ship types. For agonizing minutes, there was only radio static. The rearming process in the hangars was halted in chaos. Mechanics stood frozen, waiting for orders, surrounded by loose bombs and highly volatile aviation fuel.
At 8:09 a.m., the scout plane reported that the ships appeared to be 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers.
Nagumo exhaled. Cruisers were not an existential threat to his carriers. He could handle cruisers. But then, at 8:20 a.m., came the transmission that sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. Tone Number 4 reported, "Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier." An aircraft carrier. The ultimate nightmare was suddenly real. Nagumo was now caught in a tactical straitjacket. His strike force returning from Midway, under Tominaga, was appearing in the sky above the fleet. They were low on fuel, many were damaged, and the pilots were exhausted. They needed to land immediately, or they would have to ditch in the ocean. Meanwhile, his reserve planes in the hangars were still a disorganized mess, armed with a mix of land bombs and torpedoes.
Vice Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the brilliant, aggressive commander of the Hiryu and Soryu, signalled Nagumo with desperate urgency. "Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately." Yamaguchi wanted to launch the reserve planes right now, armed with whatever they had, to strike the American carrier before it could launch its own planes. But Nagumo hesitated. Launching the reserve planes would take at least 45 minutes of spotting them on the flight deck. During that time, Tominaga's returning planes would run out of fuel and crash into the sea. Furthermore, Japanese doctrine dictated that strikes must be heavily coordinated and escorted by fighters. Nagumo made the fatal choice to play it safe. He decided to clear his flight decks, recover the returning Midway strike force, take them below, bring the reserve planes up, arm them properly with torpedoes, and launch a massive, perfect, coordinated strike to destroy the American carrier. It was a decision rooted in logic, caution, and a fatal underestimation of the enemy.
While Nagumo hesitated, the Americans had already thrown the dice. Hours earlier, Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Spruance had received the reports of the Japanese carrier's location. They knew they had the element of surprise. They did not wait to form a perfectly coordinated strike. They knew that in carrier warfare, the side that strikes first almost always wins. They ordered every available strike aircraft into the air.
From the decks of the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown,
a massive, disjointed swarm of American aircraft clawed their way into the sky. There were heavy, sluggish TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. There were the rugged SBD Dauntless dive bombers. And there were the F-4F Wildcat fighters for escort. But the launch was chaotic. The American airmen were inexperienced in mass fleet operations. The squadrons became separated in the thick clouds. They burned precious fuel trying to form up. Eventually, the commanders realized they could not wait. They ordered the squadrons to proceed to the target independently. It was a fragmented, uncoordinated assault, but it was relentless.
The first Americans to find the Japanese fleet were the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, launching from the USS Hornet, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron.
Waldron was a fierce, uncompromising leader of Oglala Lakota descent. During the flight, he had violently disagreed with the Hornet's air group commander over the projected location of the Japanese fleet. Trusting his own tactical instincts, Waldron broke radio silence, broke away from the main group, and led his 15 Devastator torpedo bombers on a different heading. He was right. He found the Kido Butai. But Waldron found them completely alone. His fighter escort had become lost in the clouds. He was facing the entire might of the Japanese fleet, with 15 slow, obsolete aircraft, carrying unreliable torpedoes with absolutely no fighter protection. Waldron did not hesitate. He ordered his men to attack. What followed was a massacre of heartbreaking proportions. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of Elite Zero fighters, swarmed down upon Torpedo 8 like angry hornets. The Devastators had to fly low, straight and level, just above the waves to drop their torpedoes, making them sitting ducks. The Zeros tore into them, their cannons shredding the thin metal of the American planes. One by one, the Devastators burst into flames and crashed into the ocean. Waldron's plane was hit, its fuel tank erupting into a fireball. He was seen standing up in his burning cockpit before the plane plunged into the sea. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, all 15 were shot down. Out of 30 men, only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the water, watching the battle unfold around him. They did not score a single hit. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived. They too attacked without fighter cover. They too were slaughtered. 10 out of 14 planes were destroyed. No hits. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. They had a brief fighter escort, but the Zeros easily bypassed the Wildcats and annihilated the torpedo bombers. 10 out of 12 planes were shot down. No hits. By 10:15 a.m., the American torpedo bomber assault had been utterly crushed. Dozens of young American aviators had been killed. Admiral Nagumo and his staff on the Akagi watched the slaughter with grim satisfaction. The American attacks had been disjointed, poorly executed, and easily swatted away. The Japanese fleet was completely unscathed. Nagumo's decision to wait seemed entirely vindicated. Below decks, the frantic rearming of the Japanese reserve planes was finally complete. The massive elevators began lifting the fully armed, fully fueled Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers to the wooden flight decks. The Zeros of the Combat Air Patrol, having expended their ammunition and fuel slaughtering the American torpedo bombers, were ordered to land for quick refueling and rearming. The Japanese were minutes away from launching a devastating counterstrike that would wipe out the American carriers. But the tragic, suicidal sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. In the brutal, three-dimensional chessboard of aerial warfare, they had unwittingly achieved something miraculous. By attacking at sea level, the torpedo bombers had drawn the entire Japanese fighter defense down to the deck. Every single Zero was skimming the waves. Furthermore, the relentless, chaotic American attacks had forced the Japanese carriers into wild, evasive maneuvers, preventing them from spotting their strike aircraft on the flight decks. Most importantly, the torpedo bombers had drawn the eyes of every Japanese lookout, every gunner, every captain, and every admiral down to the surface of the ocean. No one was looking up. High above the Japanese fleet, at an altitude of 20,000 feet, the sky was completely empty of defending fighters. And into this pristine, unguarded sky flew the instrument of Japanese doom. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers of the USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey. McCluskey's journey to this exact coordinate in space and time had been a harrowing trial of endurance and luck. He and his two squadrons had flown to the intercepted coordinates, but found nothing but empty ocean. The Japanese had changed course. McCluskey's planes were running dangerously low on fuel. Doctrine dictated he should turn back, but McCluskey made a gut decision to push on, turning his formation north. For agonizing minutes, they searched the vast blue void. Fuel gauges tapped against the empty pins. Then, McCluskey looked down and saw a faint white streak on the ocean surface. It was the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which had been left behind to depth charge an American submarine and was now racing at top speed to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey followed the arrow of the destroyer's wake. At 10:20 a.m., McCluskey looked through his canopy and saw the breathtaking, terrifying sight of the entire Kido Butai spread out below him. The carriers Akagi and Kaga were steaming in a loose formation, their massive yellow flight decks gleaming in the morning sun, packed end to end with fully fueled, fully armed strike aircraft. At that exact, miraculous moment, completely by chance, another squadron of American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie from the USS Yorktown, arrived over the fleet from a completely different direction, positioning themselves perfectly over the carrier Soryu. It was an accidental, perfectly synchronized, three-pronged attack. The time was 10:22 a.m. The 5 minutes that would doom the Japanese Empire had begun. McCluskey broke radio silence. His voice crackled in the headsets of dozens of tense, exhausted American pilots. Attack! Attack! The American Dauntless dive bombers pushed their noses down. They extended their perforated dive flaps to control their speed, plunging into a near-vertical 70-degree dive. The wind screamed through the dive flaps, creating a terrifying, howling shriek that tore through the sky. Inside the cockpits, the G-forces pushed the pilots against their restraints. The crosshairs of their telescopic sights settled upon the massive, yellow-painted decks of the Japanese carriers. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was looking out over his flight deck. The planes were spotted, their engines warming up. The strike leader was in his cockpit, ready to give the signal to launch. Suddenly, a Japanese lookout screamed, pointing frantically toward the sky. "Helldivers!" Nagumo looked up. Plummeting out of the blue, growing larger with terrifying speed, were the dark silhouettes of the American dive bombers. There was no time to launch fighters. There was no time to maneuver. There was only time to brace for the apocalypse. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, set his sights on the Akagi. The first 2 American bombs narrowly missed, sending geysers of white water erupting alongside the carrier. But Dick Best's aim was true. He released his 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb at an altitude of just 1,500 feet and violently pulled out of his dive. The bomb plummeted with devastating precision. It struck the Akagi perfectly amidships, directly behind the midship elevator. It smashed through the wooden flight deck and detonated deep inside the enclosed upper hangar deck. In normal circumstances, a single bomb hit might not destroy a massive fleet carrier. But the Akagi was not in a normal state. The hangar deck was an absolute worst-case scenario. Because of Nagumo's frantic, alternating orders, the enclosed space was cluttered with highly explosive aerial torpedoes and unarmoured, high-explosive land bombs that the exhausted mechanics had simply pushed against the bulkheads to get them out of the way. Furthermore, the aircraft spotted on the flight deck and in the hangar were fully loaded with high-octane aviation fuel. Fuel lines were still draped across the decks. Best's bomb detonated right in the middle of this massive powder keg. The explosion was catastrophic. It instantly ignited the aviation fuel, creating a massive fireball that swept through the hangar deck. The heat was so intense that it immediately cooked off the stacked torpedoes and bombs. A chain reaction of colossal, sympathetic detonations ripped the Akagi apart from the inside out. Massive sections of the steel flight deck peeled back like the lid of a tin can. Fire erupted from the elevator shafts. The flagship of the Kido Butai, the pride of the Japanese Navy,
was instantly transformed into a blazing, uncontrollable inferno. Simultaneously, a few miles away, the carrier cargo was enduring an even more brutal, agonizing death. McCluskey's remaining dive bombers swarmed the massive ship. The cargo was struck by no fewer than 4,000-pound bombs. One bomb struck the forward elevator, blowing it completely out of its shaft and sending it crashing back down into the hangar. Another bomb struck directly on the bridge, instantly incinerating the captain and the entire senior command staff. The remaining bombs plunged into the hangar deck, igniting the same catastrophic chain reaction of fuel and ordnance that was destroying the Akagi. Hundreds of Japanese sailors and mechanics were instantly vaporized in the blasts. The cargo was completely engulfed in a raging firestorm, thick black smoke billowing thousands of feet into the air, completely obscuring the ship from view. At that exact same moment, Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers plummeted toward the carrier Soryu. Leslie himself had a defective bomb release and had accidentally dropped his bomb into the ocean earlier in the flight. But he dove anyway to strafe the deck and draw fire. His squadron followed him down. The Soryu was struck by 3,000-pound bombs in rapid succession. The first hit the flight deck forward, the second hit amidships, and the third hit aft. The explosions shattered the ship's boilers, instantly stopping the Soryu dead in the water. Just like her sister ships, the Soryu's packed hangar deck became a slaughterhouse of secondary explosions. Within minutes, the Soryu was a burning, sinking wreck. Its crew forced to abandon ship into the burning, oil-slicked waters. The time was 10:27 a.m. In exactly 5 minutes, the course of the Second World War had been violently, irrevocably altered. The Kido Butai, the invincible armada that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been decapitated. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were burning, gutted hulks, doomed to sink to the dark depths of the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo, in a state of absolute shock, stood on the burning bridge of the Akagi, refusing to leave until his staff physically dragged him away, forcing him to transfer his flag to a nearby cruiser. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered, replaced by the horrific reality of burning steel and drowning men. But the Battle of Midway was not over. Out of the 4 Japanese carriers, 1 had survived. The Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive, brilliant Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had been sailing miles ahead of the main formation, hidden beneath a rain squall. Yamaguchi watched in horror as his 3 sister ships went up in flames. He knew the battle was lost, but Japanese martial honor demanded retaliation. He did not wait for orders. He immediately launched a counterstrike of dive bombers and fighter escorts, ordering them to follow the retreating American planes back to their source. The Japanese strike force followed the American Dauntlesses through the sky and found the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown's radar picked them up, and Admiral Fletcher scrambled his defending Wildcats. A fierce, swirling dogfight erupted over the American carrier. The American fighters and anti-aircraft fire decimated the incoming Japanese planes, but a few experienced Japanese pilots broke through the defensive screen. They pushed into their dives. 3 Japanese bombs struck the Yorktown. One bomb blew a massive hole in the flight deck, destroying several parked aircraft. Another pierced the smokestack, rupturing the boiler flues and instantly extinguishing the ship's fires. The Yorktown lost all power, grinding to a halt, dead in the water, trailing a thick column of black smoke. But the American damage control teams were arguably the best in the world. They had already resurrected the Yorktown once at Pearl Harbor. They went to work with frantic, disciplined efficiency. They patched the flight deck, bypassed the ruptured flues, and incredibly, within 2 hours, they had the ship's boilers relit. The Yorktown began to move again, building speed, her flight deck operational. When the second wave of Yamaguchi's counterstrike, a squadron of heavily armed Kate torpedo bombers, arrived over the area, they saw a carrier steaming at 20 knots, showing no heavy smoke.
They assumed the burning carrier they had been told about had sunk, and that this was a second, undamaged American carrier. They attacked with ruthless precision. 2 Japanese aerial torpedoes slammed into the port side of the Yorktown. The explosions tore massive holes beneath the waterline, flooding the generator rooms. The ship immediately took on a severe, terrifying 26-degree list to port. The flight deck tilted at a sickening angle. Believing the ship was about to capsize, the captain gave the agonizing order to abandon ship. The crew slid down ropes into the oil-slicked water, leaving the battered veteran of Coral Sea to slowly die.
Aboard the Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi received the reports from his returning pilots. They claimed they had heavily damaged one carrier and sunk another. Yamaguchi believed he had evened the odds. He believed there was only one American carrier left, and he prepared to launch a third, twilight strike, to finish the job. He ordered his exhausted mechanics to arm the few remaining aircraft he had left. But Yamaguchi's intelligence was wrong. He had hit the Yorktown twice. The Enterprise and the Hornet were entirely untouched, and Admiral Raymond Spruance was preparing to deliver the final, crushing blow. Late in the afternoon, American scout planes located the Hiryu. Spruance immediately launched a massive strike package from the Enterprise, reinforced by orphan dive bombers from the abandoned Yorktown. As the sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the Pacific, the American Dauntlesses arrived over the lone surviving Japanese carrier. Yamaguchi's exhausted combat air patrol fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The American dive bombers pushed over into their terrifying, shrieking dives. The Hiryu maneuvered violently, avoiding the first wave of bombs, but the Americans kept coming. 4,000-pound bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession. The forward section of the flight deck was blown completely off, folding back over the bridge like a massive, twisted piece of cardboard. The explosions ignited the familiar, deadly chain reaction of aviation fuel and ordnance. The Hiryu was gutted by fire. Her forward half transformed into a blazing, impassable inferno. The Kido Butai was completely destroyed. As night fell over the Pacific, the burning hulks of the 4 Japanese carriers illuminated the darkness like massive, floating funeral pyres. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the most capable carrier commander in the Japanese Navy, recognized the totality of the defeat. He ordered his surviving crew to abandon ship, but Yamaguchi himself, adhering to the strict, fatalistic code of the samurai, chose to remain aboard. He shared a final cup of water with the ship's captain, tying himself to the bridge compass binnacle. A Japanese destroyer fired torpedoes into the burning wreck of the Hiryu to scuttle her, sending Yamaguchi and the last remnants of Japan's elite carrier force to the bottom of the ocean. Hundreds of miles to the west, aboard the massive super battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the disjointed, horrific reports of the battle. He was plunged into a state of profound shock and despair. His incredibly complex plan had unravelled into an absolute catastrophe. Desperate to salvage some shred of victory, Yamamoto ordered his massive surface fleet of battleships and cruisers to rush eastward through the night, hoping to catch the American carriers in a night surface battle, where the massive guns of his battleships would reign supreme. But Admiral Raymond Spruance was too smart to take the bait. He knew he had won a historic victory. He knew his aviators were exhausted and his ships were vulnerable in the dark. Adhering strictly to Nimitz's principle of calculated risk, Spruance ordered Task Force 16 to turn east, sailing away from the approaching Japanese armada, preserving his precious carriers. When dawn broke on June 5th, Yamamoto realized the Americans were gone. He had no air cover, and his fleet was entirely exposed to land-based bombers from Midway. With a heavy heart, Yamamoto issued the bitter, humiliating order to cancel Operation MI and retreat. The invincible Japanese fleet turned its tail and sailed back toward the home islands in defeat. The Battle of Midway was over. The cost was staggering. The Japanese lost 4 magnificent heavy fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and nearly 300 aircraft. But the most devastating loss, a loss from which the Japanese Empire would never recover, was the human cost. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed. Among the dead were hundreds of Japan's most experienced, combat-hardened veteran pilots. The men who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack and swept across the Pacific. Even more devastating was the loss of the elite, highly trained aviation mechanics and armourers who went down in the flaming hangar decks. Japan's industrial base and training programs were entirely incapable of replacing these highly skilled men. The razor-sharp edge of the Japanese military machine had been permanently blunted. The Americans suffered grievous losses as well. The battered, heroic USS Yorktown, while being towed back to Pearl Harbor, was ambushed and sunk by a Japanese submarine, taking a destroyer down with her. The United States lost 150 aircraft and over 300 men. Entire squadrons, like the heroic Torpedo 8, had been completely wiped out. But strategically, the American victory was absolute, total, and world-changing. In the span of a single day, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted. Before Midway, the United States was fighting a desperate rearguard defensive war, trying to hold back an unstoppable tide. After those fateful 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, the Japanese offensive juggernaut was permanently halted. They would never again launch a major strategic offensive in the Pacific. The initiative had passed to the Americans. The long, bloody, island-hopping road to Tokyo had been opened. The Battle of Midway stands as one of the most astonishing turnarounds in military history. It was a victory forged in the quiet brilliance of codebreakers, working in a basement, in the miraculous industrial willpower of shipyard workers, in the steady, analytical command of admirals who knew when to risk everything, and most importantly, in the unparalleled, suicidal courage of young men flying obsolete airplanes through walls of anti-aircraft fire. It was a battle decided by agonizing dilemmas, fatal hesitations, and the chaotic, unpredictable nature of war. But above all, it will forever be remembered for those 5 terrifying, apocalyptic minutes. 5 minutes where the sky rained fire. 5 minutes where an empire's dreams of conquest were shattered. 5 minutes that doomed the Japanese fleet and saved the world.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.